January 18, 1944. Camp Concordia, Kansas. Dawn broke across the flat prairie with a pale, colorless light that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The wind carried the scent of frozen earth and distant livestock. Inside the long wooden mess hall of the prisoner-of-war compound, 200 German soldiers sat in stunned silence, staring at metal trays laden with food they could not comprehend. Steam rose from scrambled eggs cooked in real butter. Toast sat stacked in geometric precision. And there, in small paper cups beside each plate, was a thick, tan substance that glistened under the fluorescent lights. None of them knew what it was. One young Gefreiter from the 21st Panzer Division, a man named Klaus Weber who had been captured 3 months earlier in Tunisia, poked the substance with his fork and whispered to the man beside him in disbelief. "What kind of grease is this?" The American mess sergeant, a farm boy from Iowa with ruddy cheeks and an easy smile, simply grinned and said one word, "Peanut butter." The men laughed. Not with joy, but with the bitter, confused laughter of soldiers who believed they had been sent to hell and were now being mocked by abundance they could not trust. They had been told America was weak. They had been told the democratic experiment had failed, that capitalism had collapsed into breadlines and Hoovervilles, that the American soldier was soft, undisciplined, and poorly fed. Now they sat in a heated barracks with running water, looking at more food on a single tray than many had seen in a week on the Eastern Front. The peanut butter sat there like an accusation, like a challenge to everything they believed. And for weeks, most of them refused to touch it. To understand why something as simple as peanut butter became a symbol of ideological collapse, one must first understand what these men had endured, what they had been taught, and what they expected to find when they crossed the Atlantic in the cramped holds of transport ships, guarded by men they had been trained to see as racial inferiors. The German soldier of 1943 and 1944 was a creature forged in the furnace of total war. He had survived the scorching deserts of North Africa, where water was rationed to a single canteen per day and temperatures soared past 120 degrees. He had frozen in the snow-choked forests of Russia, where frostbite claimed fingers and toes faster than Soviet bullets. He had eaten hardtack so stale it could crack teeth, drunk ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, chewed on stale black bread that tasted of sawdust and desperation. The rations of the Wehrmacht had deteriorated steadily since 1941. Meat became a memory. Butter vanished. Sugar was hoarded like gold. By 1943, the average German infantry division received fewer than 2,000 calories per man per day, and much of that came in the form of thin soups, moldy potatoes, and bread adulterated with wood pulp to stretch dwindling grain supplies. But physical hunger was only part of the equation. These men had been fed a different kind of hunger, a hunger of the mind and spirit, carefully cultivated by years of propaganda that told them they were the master race, that their cause was just, that their enemies were degenerate, corrupt, and doomed. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels had worked tirelessly to paint a picture of America as a mongrel nation, a chaotic jumble of races and ideologies held together only by Jewish financial manipulation and exploitative capitalism. German soldiers were shown images of Depression-era breadlines, told that American workers were starving while their bosses grew fat, assured that the American military was a rabble of undisciplined immigrants and oppressed minorities who would break at the first sight of disciplined German steel. They believed that American industry was a myth, that the reports of mass production were lies designed to boost morale, that the tanks and planes arriving in North Africa were scraped together from the last desperate reserves of a dying system. They had been taught that democracy was weakness, that individualism was chaos, that freedom was simply another word for decadence. And many of them believed it with the fervor of true faith. So when Klaus Weber and thousands like him were captured, when they were loaded onto ships and transported across an ocean they expected to be the grave of American convoys, when they arrived at camps scattered across the American heartland, they expected vindication. They expected to see the collapse they had been promised. They expected prisoner-of-war camps that mirrored the brutal conditions of Soviet or even German camps, places of hunger and hardship and cruelty. Instead, they found Camp Concordia. They found Camp Alva in Oklahoma, Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp McCain in Mississippi, Camp Ruston in Louisiana. They found barracks with electric lights and coal stoves. They found showers with hot water. They found infirmaries stocked with medicines that had become unattainable in Germany itself. And they found food. So much food that it became impossible to ignore, impossible to explain away, impossible to reconcile with everything they had been told. The first morning at Camp Concordia, January 17, 1944, was the moment when cognitive dissonance took root in the mind of Klaus Weber and thousands of German prisoners across America. The peanut butter sat there in its little paper cup, absurd and inexplicable. It was not part of the ration. It was not doled out with miserly precision. It was simply there, offered casually, as if food were not a precious resource to be fought over but an assumption, a baseline of existence. Weber did not touch it that first morning. Neither did most of his comrades. They ate the eggs suspiciously, convinced there must be a trick, that this abundance was temporary, a psychological operation designed to soften them for interrogation. They waited for the other shoe to drop. It never did. Breakfast the next morning was the same. Eggs, toast, oatmeal with brown sugar, coffee that was real coffee, not the burnt barley substitute they had choked down for years. And peanut butter. Always peanut butter. On the third morning, Weber watched as an American guard spread the tan paste on a piece of toast and bit into it with obvious pleasure. The guard noticed him watching and, through a translator, explained that peanut butter was a staple of the American diet, that children grew up eating it, that it was cheap, nutritious, and everywhere. Weber found this incomprehensible. A nation that fed its children a protein-rich food as a common staple? A nation with such abundance that this strange paste was unremarkable? It did not fit. It could not fit. But the evidence was undeniable. By the end of the first week, curiosity overcame ideology. Weber tasted peanut butter for the first time, spreading a small amount on toast the way he had seen the guards do. The taste was strange, simultaneously sweet and savory, rich and heavy on the tongue. It stuck to the roof of his mouth. He did not like it immediately, but he could not deny its substance, its density, the way it filled his stomach in a way that ersatz rations never had. Other prisoners began to experiment. Some mixed it with the jam that was also freely available. Some ate it straight from the cup with a spoon. A few enterprising souls discovered that it could be spread on the apples that were distributed with astonishing regularity, creating a combination that seemed almost decadent. And slowly, grudgingly, the laughter stopped. The mockery faded. And the peanut butter began to disappear from the trays. This was not an isolated phenomenon. Records from the Office of the Provost Marshal General, the agency responsible for overseeing German and Italian prisoners of war in the United States, document a consistent pattern across camps nationwide. German POWs gained an average of 15 to 20 pounds during their first 3 months of captivity. Medical officers noted dramatic improvements in overall health, reductions in malnutrition-related illnesses, and a decline in the gaunt, hollow-eyed appearance that characterized newly arrived prisoners. Daily caloric intake for POWs in American camps averaged between 3,000 and 3,500 calories, exceeding not only their wartime rations but often surpassing what German civilians were receiving back home. The food was not gourmet, but it was abundant, varied, and reliable. Breakfast typically included eggs or oatmeal, bread, butter, jam, and coffee. Lunch might be soup, sandwiches, fruit, and milk. Dinner featured meat, potatoes or rice, vegetables, bread, and dessert. Between meals, Canteen facilities allowed prisoners to purchase with camp scrip additional items like candy bars, soft drinks, and yes, more peanut butter. The psychological impact of this abundance cannot be overstated. For soldiers raised in a system that prized sacrifice, discipline, and the subordination of individual needs to the collective will, the casual plenty of American camps was destabilizing. It challenged foundational assumptions. If America was weak and decadent, how could it feed its prisoners better than Germany fed its soldiers? If capitalism was collapsing, why were the store shelves in camp canteens stocked with goods that had vanished from German cities years ago? If the American people were suffering under plutocratic oppression, why did their guards seem so relaxed, so well-fed, so utterly unconcerned with the material struggle that defined daily life in wartime Europe? These questions had no easy answers within the framework of Nazi ideology, and the dissonance grew stronger with each passing day, with each meal, with each spoonful of peanut butter that represented not just food but a worldview. Klaus Weber kept a secret diary during his captivity, a violation of camp rules but a common practice among educated prisoners. The diary, which was donated to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans by his son in 2003, provides a rare first-hand account of the psychological transformation many POWs underwent. In an entry dated February 10, 1944, he wrote, "Today I ate peanut butter on bread with raspberry jam. I thought of my mother in Dresden, trying to make soup from potato peels. I thought of my brother in Stalingrad, who wrote that he and his comrades had boiled their leather belts to make broth. Here, we throw away food we do not want. The Americans do not understand what this means. To them, this is normal. To me, it is madness. Or perhaps we are the mad ones, and they are sane. I do not know any more." This crisis of understanding accelerated as prisoners were introduced to other aspects of American life. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be compelled to work, provided the labor was not directly related to the war effort. The United States took full advantage of this provision, deploying German POWs as agricultural laborers, lumber workers, and laborers in food processing plants. This was partly economic necessity, as American workers had been drafted or moved to higher-paying war industries, leaving critical labor shortages in rural areas. But it also had an unintended consequence. It brought German soldiers into direct contact with ordinary Americans, allowing them to see with their own eyes the material reality of American society. Klaus Weber was assigned to a work detail at a wheat farm outside Concordia. He worked alongside local farmers, ate lunch at their tables, and saw their homes, their trucks, their tractors, their radios, their refrigerators filled with food. In a diary entry from March 1944, he wrote, "The farmer, Mr. Henderson, is not wealthy. He complains about prices and weather and government regulations. But his children are healthy and fat. His wife serves us sandwiches with meat and cheese and peanut butter as if these things cost nothing. Their dog eats better than my family. This is not propaganda. I see it with my eyes. I do not understand how we were told America was poor." Other prisoners reported similar experiences. At Camp Hearn in Texas, German POWs worked in cotton fields and timber operations. At Camp Alva in Oklahoma, they harvested wheat and maintained irrigation systems. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, they processed sweet potatoes and pecans. Everywhere they went, they encountered an abundance that defied explanation. They saw small towns with paved roads and electric streetlights. They saw general stores stocked with canned goods, fresh produce, and luxury items like cigarettes and candy. They saw ordinary workers driving automobiles, a luxury in Germany reserved for the wealthy or politically connected. They saw waste, too, mountains of waste that scandalized men raised in a culture of scarcity. Americans threw away food that was merely unappetizing, discarded clothing that was merely unfashionable, replaced tools that were merely old. To the German prisoners, This was incomprehensible, obscene, and undeniable proof that the world they thought they knew was a lie. The peanut butter became a symbol of this larger realization, a simple, humble food that represented the vast chasm between propaganda and reality. It was cheap, ubiquitous, and unremarkable to Americans, yet it was exotic, nourishing, and emblematic of surplus to the prisoners. Some men began requesting it specifically, trading other rations or canteen scrip to obtain more. Others wrote about it in letters home, carefully worded to pass the censors, describing this strange American food and the strange American plenty that surrounded them. The letters were read by families in bombed-out German cities where ration cards entitled one to perhaps a quarter-pound of bread per day and a tablespoon of margarine per week if supplies permitted. The contrast was devastating. Not all prisoners underwent this transformation willingly or peacefully. Within the camps, a shadow struggle unfolded between those who clung to Nazi ideology and those who began to question. Hardcore Nazis, often officers or members of the SS who had been mixed in with regular Wehrmacht soldiers, formed internal policing structures. They enforced discipline, punished defeatism, and sometimes murdered prisoners deemed traitors to the cause. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, a German prisoner named Johannes Kunz was beaten to death by fellow POWs in November 1943 for being too friendly with American guards and speaking positively about American conditions. At Camp Chesterfield in South Carolina, similar internal violence erupted. At Camp Papago Park in Arizona, a daring escape attempt in December 1944 saw 25 German prisoners tunnel out of the camp, though all were eventually recaptured. The escape was motivated partly by the traditional military duty to attempt escape, but also by a desire among the escapees to reject the comfortable captivity that they felt was designed to weaken their resolve and corrupt their loyalty. For these men, accepting American abundance, including peanut butter, was tantamount to betrayal. To enjoy captivity was to collaborate with the enemy. They preferred hunger and hardship if it meant maintaining ideological purity. But they were fighting a losing battle against the stubborn persistence of material reality. By mid-1944, as the war in Europe turned decisively against Germany, as news filtered into the camps of Allied advances and German retreats, as letters from home described worsening conditions and increasing bombing raids, the psychological hold of Nazi propaganda weakened. The men in the camps could see that they were healthy, well-fed, and safe while their comrades on the front lines were dying and their families at home were starving. The guilt was immense, but so was the creeping realization that perhaps they had been lied to, that perhaps the sacrifices demanded of them had been in service of a doomed and evil cause. Peanut butter could not answer the great moral questions of the war, but it was a daily, tangible reminder that the world was not as they had been told. Klaus Weber's diary entries from late 1944 reflect this deepening crisis. In October, he wrote, "We heard today that Aachen has fallen. The Americans are in Germany. My sister lives near there. I do not know if she is alive. Here, I ate pork chops and mashed potatoes and green beans and apple pie. I feel sick, not from the food, but from the knowing. I am safe and fed while my country dies. Is this mercy or cruelty? I think it is both." In December, after the failed Ardennes offensive that became known as the Battle of the Bulge, he wrote, "Some of the men celebrated when we heard Germany had attacked. They said the tide would turn, that our armies would drive the Americans into the sea. But I looked at the guards, at their new uniforms and their full bellies and their easy confidence, and I knew it was over. A nation that can feed its prisoners like this, that can afford to be generous to its enemies, cannot be defeated by a nation that is starving. We have lost. I think we lost before we even began." The statistical evidence supports Weber's grim assessment. American industrial production during World War II was staggering, outpacing all other combatants combined. By 1944, the United States was producing one aircraft every 5 minutes, one ship every day, and tens of thousands of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces every month. Agricultural output had increased by 30% despite the draft removing millions of farm workers, thanks to mechanization, improved fertilizers, and the deployment of POW labor. The United States fed not only its own civilian population and military, but also supplied significant food aid to Britain, the Soviet Union, and liberated territories in Europe and Asia through Lend-Lease and relief programs. The peanut butter that German prisoners ate in Kansas was produced in factories that ran around the clock, using peanuts harvested from fields in Georgia and Alabama by a combination of American workers, POW labor, and increasingly mechanized equipment. It was canned, labeled, and distributed by a logistics network of such scale and efficiency that it could afford to treat enemy prisoners better than their own nation treated its soldiers. This was not kindness, though individual Americans were often kind. It was capacity. It was the raw, undeniable power of an economic system that, whatever its flaws, had proven capable of mobilizing resources on a scale the world had never seen. By 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final months, the transformation of many German POWs was nearly complete. Re-education programs, authorized by the U.S. government and implemented in camps across the country, exposed prisoners to democratic ideals, American history, and uncensored news about the war, including the liberation of concentration camps and the full scope of Nazi atrocities. Many prisoners resisted this information, dismissing it as propaganda. But the cognitive dissonance was too great to maintain indefinitely. How could they believe American reports of concentration camps were lies when everything else the Americans had told them, everything they had personally experienced, had turned out to be true? If the Americans had been honest about their own material abundance, if they had been honest about the progress of the war, if they had treated prisoners with a decency that exceeded Geneva Convention requirements, why would they lie about the camps? The psychological defense mechanisms crumbled, and many prisoners were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that they had served evil. Klaus Weber was one of them. In his final diary entry, dated May 10, 1945, 3 days after Germany's unconditional surrender, he wrote, "The war is over. Germany has fallen. The Führer is dead, they say by his own hand. We have been defeated utterly. I should feel grief, but I feel only relief and shame. Relief that I will not die, that I may someday see my family again if they have survived. Shame that I believed the lies, that I wore the uniform, that I did not question until it was too late. Here in this camp in Kansas, eating food I once mocked, I have learned that freedom is not weakness and abundance is not decadence. I have learned that a nation which can afford to be generous is stronger than a nation which demands sacrifice. I have learned that peanut butter, this silly American food I laughed at, is worth more than all the glory of the Reich. Because it is real. Because it sustains life. Because it represents a society that values the individual enough to ensure he does not go hungry, even if he is an enemy. I do not know if I can ever forgive myself for what I was part of, but I know now that the life we were promised in Germany was a fantasy built on blood and lies. The life here, this ordinary, comfortable, wasteful, generous American life, is real. And I want to be part of it. Weber's sentiment was not universal. Many German POWs returned home after the war still clinging to their beliefs, embittered by defeat and resentful of their captivity, however comfortable it had been. But a significant number did undergo genuine ideological transformation. Post-war surveys conducted by American military intelligence found that approximately 40% of German POWs held in the United States expressed some degree of pro-democratic sentiment by the end of the war, a dramatic increase from the single-digit percentages recorded in 1943. Many sought to emigrate to the United States or other Allied countries after repatriation. Some succeeded, building new lives far from the rubble of Germany, carrying with them memories of Kansas prairies and peanut butter sandwiches and the realization that the world they had been taught to despise was, in fact, the world they wanted to join. The irony of the peanut butter story is that it was never intended as a tool of ideological warfare. It was simply what Americans ate, a cheap protein source invented in the late 19th century, popularized in the early 20th century, and mass-produced during the war as part of the standard military and institutional diet. Its power lay not in any inherent quality but in what it represented. A nation so wealthy, so productive, so confident in its own system that it could feed its enemies without a second thought. It was the opposite of the German experience, where every scrap of food was a political act, where rations were weapons used to enforce loyalty and punish dissent, where hunger was a tool of control. American abundance was casual, almost thoughtless, and that casualness was more subversive than any propaganda film or re-education lecture. It was evidence that could not be argued with, reality that could not be dismissed. You cannot convince a starving man that he is not hungry, and you cannot convince a well-fed prisoner that the system feeding him is weak. In the decades that followed, peanut butter continued its quiet conquest of the world, spreading through American cultural and economic influence to become a global commodity. But for the men who sat in mess halls across Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Mississippi in 1944 and 1945, it remained forever a symbol of the moment their worldview shattered. It was the moment they realized that strength was not only found in discipline and sacrifice, that power was not only exercised through control and domination, that a society built on freedom and prosperity could be more resilient, more formidable, and more generous than any totalitarian machine. It was the moment they learned that sometimes the most devastating weapon is not a bomb or a bullet but a simple jar of creamy, golden-brown paste that says, without words, "We have enough. We have more than enough. Even for you, our enemy." Klaus Weber survived the war, returned to Germany in 1946, and emigrated to the United States in 1952 under a special visa program for former POWs with clean records. He settled in Iowa, not far from where the mess sergeant who first introduced him to peanut butter had grown up. He became a citizen, raised a family, and worked as a machinist until his retirement in 1982. He never spoke publicly about his wartime service, but he kept his diary, and before his death in 1997, he entrusted it to his son with instructions that it be donated to a museum so that others might understand what he had learned. In the diary's introduction, added in the 1980s, he wrote a final reflection: "I was taught to hate America. I was taught that democracy was chaos and freedom was weakness. I was taught that sacrifice and obedience were the highest virtues. And then I was captured, and I was fed, and I was treated like a human being by people I had been told were subhuman. It took time, but eventually I understood. The peanut butter was not just food. It was a message. It said, you were lied to. It said, there is another way. It said, you can choose differently. I did choose differently. I chose life over glory, abundance over sacrifice, freedom over obedience. I do not regret it. I only regret that I did not choose sooner, before so many died for lies." The story of German POWs and peanut butter is not a story of conversion or redemption in the simple sense. Many men never changed their minds. Many suffered from the cognitive dissonance until their deaths, unable to reconcile what they had believed with what they had experienced. But for those who did change, the transformation was profound and irreversible. They had touched the material reality of a system they were taught to despise, and they found it more substantial, more humane, and more powerful than the ideology that had sent them to war. They had laughed at peanut butter because it was foreign and strange and seemed to mock their suffering. But in time, they came to love it, not for its taste, which many never truly enjoyed, but for what it represented: the possibility of a world where abundance was normal, where generosity was possible, where even enemies could be fed. That possibility, once glimpsed, could not be unseen. It haunted them, challenged them, and ultimately changed them. And it all began with a small paper cup of tan paste, sitting on a metal tray in a Kansas mess hall on a cold January morning, waiting to be understood.